So what do you think, Ruslan? Shall we start?
Yes.
Yes.
I think so.
So I don't know, depending on where you are in the world, good morning or good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to this online seminar, the second day of this seminar, entitled The Impact of the War on Religious Life, a Focus on Ukraine. We had yesterday very interesting discussions already, and today I believe we will continue. So my name is Milda Alisauskiene. I am a sociologist from Vytautas Magnus University here in Lithuania, currently based in Vilnius. And together with Iryna, Fenno, I will be chairing this second panel discussion entitled The Response of Different Denominations to the War, Competition versus Collaboration. And the organizers suggest that we have two topics for discussion. First, the impact of Ukraine's religious pluralism as a dimension of societal resilience amid the invasion. And the second, the effects of the war on the religious landscape and daily life of Ukraine, religious activism, and new networks. So we discussed and we would propose the following order of this discussion, that we listen to all four presentations, each for 15 minutes, and then please write your questions either in chat or keep them for discussion that will take place after we listen to all presentations. So thank you. And now I would like to give word to Iryna.
And hello, everyone. For me, it's a great honor and a great pleasure to be with you in these touching days for everyone, Ukrainians and not just Ukrainians. And it's really a great opportunity being in the different countries for scholars from the different field to share our thoughts, to discuss so close connected for us topic. And my name is Iryna Fenno, and exactly I am associate professor in the National Taras Shevchenko University of Kiev and in Ukrainian Catholic University. But currently now I am a guest researcher in the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Yesterday we had very fruitful discussion, and I'm sure today we have many questions and the topics to continue to discuss. And let me start to introduce our speakers for today. We have 4 speakers and they are with us. And the first speaker is the Catherine Wanner from the Pennsylvania State University. Catherine Wanner is a cultural anthropologist with the main focus on the politics and religion, everyday religiosity, conflict mediation, and the human rights. Catherine Wanner has 6 books connected to the Ukrainian issues, and the last one published in 22, sorry, and it calls Everyday Religiosity and the Politics of Belonging in Ukraine. Thank you that you are with us, Catherine Wanner. The second speaker is Regina Elsner from Berlin, from the Center of the East European and International Studies. Regina Elsner, she is a theologian, and the main research interests are Orthodox social ethic and the peace ethic, as I understand now. Also, the Orthodox Church as a social political actor, and the Christianity and the human rights. And the last book of the Regina Elsner was published in 2021, and it calls the Russian Orthodox Church and Modernity, a historical and theological investigation into Eastern Christianity between unity and modernity. Dear Regina, thank you that you are with us today. Milda, please continue to present our speakers.
Well, thank you. I thought we will present afterwards, but But anyway, we will have also Roman Soloviy with us from Eastern European Institute of Theology, and he will be talking on Russian aggression against Ukraine, the response of national and international Protestant communities. And then we'll have the last but not least presentation by Mykhaylo Yakubovych from Freiburg University, Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, also at Coventry University. And his topic will be Reconsidering Jihad, Contemporary Narratives of Islamic Just War Theory in the Muslim Communities of Ukraine and Russia. So I suggest that now we give floor to Catherine.
Thank you very much. I would first like to acknowledge all the efforts of the organizers that went into bringing this event together. This is indeed a very challenging and emotional time for us all, which makes it hard to find time and to find the ability to concentrate. But having said that, I think it's especially in moments like these when it's especially important to come together and to discuss these issues. It's especially important to forge these kinds of international networks of resilience, to pick up some of the themes that we're going to be discussing this morning. So I offer my heartfelt thanks first and foremost to the organizers for all their efforts in making this event possible for all of us. This morning, I wanted to begin our discussion of religious pluralism by considering 4 different points that I believe pertain to religious minorities in Ukraine. And by this, I'm also including what perhaps will emerge from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. It's, as everyone knows, in the process of evolving at this moment. But most likely there will be a contingency that will become a minority of sorts. So I take them into consideration in choosing these 4 points. This full-scale invasion has resulted in a full-scale mobilization. We see massive changes on the cultural, linguistic, and of course on the religious front as well. Nearly all religious groups in Ukraine have broken relations with their co-believers in Russia. And this has created something of a parallel proxy war among religious institutions that mirrors the war on the battlefield. Outrage over the invasion, the vast disappointment over the Russian public support for expanded armed combat, and the related issues that are born of grief and anger have prompted a roster of Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, New Age, and now we see Orthodox believers as well, to break their unions and halt cooperative endeavors with co-religionists in Russia. The challenge, of course, is greatest of all for Orthodox believers and their clergy. But all of this has radically changed the religious landscape in Ukraine. But some things remain constant. And in particular, these points that I'm going to raise by way of introducing the themes of this panel and responding to the questions that our organizers have posed about resilience and transnational networks. The 4 points pertain to religious minorities, and I think thus far have remained fairly constant. The first point I would like to suggest is that the impact and the influence of religious minority groups is far greater than their numerical presence would suggest. As Milda mentioned, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I work with interviews and life histories and stories even. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why I'm sensitive often to claims in the United States that disinformation relies on lies, blatant lies, and statistics. And it strikes me in terms of the impact and influence of religious minorities. Statistics are a domain that actually present a less than accurate picture. Just to take the most numerous religious minority, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, statistics claim that about 9 to 10% of the population is affiliated with this church. For Protestants, it's usually below 4%. Roman Catholics, it's below 2%. When it comes to Jews, Muslims, and a variety of other groups, it's usually a fraction of 1%. On my related points that I'll be bringing up, begin to explain why these statistics are misleading in many respects, why the influence and impact of religious minorities in Ukraine is far greater than that numerical statement of affiliation might suggest. So just taking the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church as a leading example now, because I don't believe we have a speaker that will focus specifically on the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, I would say that they are emblematic of an overall trend that affects religious minorities or describes religious minorities. That is that although they might have a base of support in particular regions, their presence in Ukraine is quite national. What I mean by that is that, as is probably well known to most people here, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has a significant base of support in Western Ukraine and even really in 3 oblasts of Western Ukraine. But having said that, alongside that strong regional base of support, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church positions itself as an all-Ukrainian church. And of course, this was the justification for the transfer of the Archiepiscopal See from Lviv to Kiev in August 2005. But I would say that this is true of other religious minorities. Of course, a variety of Protestant groups, specifically Baptists, had a strong basis of support in the Donbass. But they too, their presence is not limited to the Donbass. Jewish cultural life has long characterized Odessa, but yet I don't think anyone would say that the Jewish presence in Ukraine is limited or in any way can be confined to Odessa. So in other words, regionally based diversity in Ukraine is very often colored by minority religious groups and helps to define those regions, very often more so than things like language or orthodoxy itself, which is often what is positive in the media and elsewhere. And related to that is the third point I would like to raise, and this pertains to the overall theme of resilience of this panel, and that is that perhaps because religious minorities do have a national presence, they very often draw on ecumenicism as a way of being and operating and functioning in Ukraine, and especially under wartime conditions. That is to say, prior to the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian legislation and governmental practices have, to an impressive degree, consistently reaffirmed the rights of a wide range of religious minorities. And this allowed religious minorities to not only take root in Ukraine, but also to thrive, and very often thrive in a way that Ukraine became a point of outreach to other areas of Eastern Europe and certainly Eurasia. Ukraine signed the major international treaties on religious freedom, which means that Ukrainian legislation recognizes the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, as well as obliges Ukrainian judges to apply precedents created by this court in deciding future related cases. And of course, the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement includes provisions to strengthen respect for human rights and reaffirm a commitment to non-discrimination of minorities and a respect for diversity. So all of this means that then religious minorities, if they when they have a strong regional presence, this has become a springboard to a national presence and its specific forms of legislation and legality that have allowed these religious minorities to not only thrive, but to also interact with each other in an ecumenical kind of a way. And the fourth point I would like to raise is that prior to the war, all of those factors have been enhanced by the fact that minority religious communities, even when they're anchored regionally and function nationally, they are able to access transnational networks in a fairly unencumbered way because of the legislation I just stated a moment ago. And this has then really fueled their influence, their activities, and their visibility in Ukraine. Many non-Orthodox religious communities, and here if we even take into consideration the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and what might remain of it, will also be embedded in transnational and global networks and religious institutions. Again, I just cite the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church as an example. It's, of course, part of the Holy See, and this brings heightened visibility to the Pope, papal pronouncements. And of course, the Pope, just the day before yesterday, issued a series of pleas for the end of this cruel war. But it also allows Roman Catholic social doctrine to influence the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and then once again in this ecumenical kind of spirit, to then pervade the religious landscape more broadly. It also allows the institutions of the global Catholic Church to be present in Ukraine. And here I'm thinking of Caritas, for example, that was, it's a large humanitarian and development organization that was among the few that continues to aid people in areas undergoing active shelling. The other large international organizations, such as UNICEF and the like, while they might provide significant forms of aid, will not do so in areas of active combat. So all this by way of saying that religious minority groups, because they are incorporated into these larger transnational networks that offer not just resources, but bodies of expertise. And here I mention also the vast expansion, not just of the military chaplaincy, but chaplaincies more broadly. Here we see, for example, Protestants drawing on the expertise of American Protestants. Of course, we had military chaplains even in the War of Independence in the United States. And of course, we have a highly developed system of chaplaincies in a variety of institutions. And that body of expertise then via Protestant groups comes then into Ukraine. I could go on with other kinds of examples about transnational networks. I think it's particularly clear in terms of Jewish communities these days. Israel is increasingly seen as something of a future model for Ukraine, how they might continue to exist after this war has been brought to a close. And of course, this is in part fueled by the fact that not only, as I mentioned, do sort of secularized Reform Jewish culture have a base in Odessa, but of course, the single largest Orthodox religious seat is in Dnipro, and Uman is, for example, the site of an extraordinary Hasidic pilgrimage that even this past September, under conditions of war, brought over 23,000 Hasidic Jews from around the world to Ukraine. I think you've seen from these examples the degree to which you have highly active, robust religious minority communities that are fully embedded in Ukrainian national life and have influence on the writing of social and legal legislation. And this has allowed them to play a prominent role via cooperation with each other in shaping the religious landscape in Ukraine. I would like to leave us with one final thought as we're going forward and considering religious minority communities and the role they might continue to play. Perhaps some of us saw a recent Kiev International Institute of Sociology survey from late 2022 that asked questions about trust. That survey was notable in two respects. One, we've seen that this increased national cohesion and tremendous outpouring of civilian mobilization has yielded social solidarity. And there's a vast increase in trust expressed for a variety of institutions far beyond the armed forces and volunteers, and the church too, I might add. It now expands to include things like the presidency and various governmental offices, even some of which used to previously be held with great disdain and suspicion. But what's noticeable about that is not just the increase in trust, but the fact that the trust for religious institutions, while remaining robust, I believe the survey put it at 61%, did not experience the same sharp rise as a variety of other institutions. And now the church now comes in at 10th place as the 10th most trusted institution after a whole series of government offices and government officials. So I would also pose going forward the question, is this perhaps the beginning of a trend that we're noticing? Or is this just statistics lying once again? I'm not certain. I'm not going to posit an answer there, but that is certainly an issue that I'll be looking at going forward, and especially looking at that going forward, how shifting aspects of the religious landscape, as they affect religious minorities, how they might also go hand in hand with perceptions of trust. So I think I'll stop there and pass the microphone to my fellow speakers. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear Dr. Wanner. I just kindly ask our audience to keep in mind our questions or to put in the chart, just because we continue with the presentation, and I would like to invite the Dr. Elsner. Floor is yours, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I also would like to pay a special thank you to the organizers for putting this event together in these days, which are really emotional for, I think, all of us. And it is also a special honor to me to speak about the Orthodox Church in front of an audience which is partly from the Orthodox churches in Ukraine. And so I feel humble to make this contribution, and I will be happy to your additions and questions in the end. So I was asked to talk about the Orthodox interrelationships in Ukraine and what happened to them during the war. The Orthodox identity of Ukraine and Ukrainian identity of the Orthodox in Ukraine have been a field of contestation for decades and even centuries, in fact. And it has also always been a field of political involvement and of political strategies. So the field is highly mixed in every direction. At the same time, Orthodoxy has never been, as Katie just said, has never been the only religion, and religious plurality has shaped the Ukrainian identity almost on an equal level as Orthodoxy, especially since the end of the Soviet Union. The independence of Ukraine in 1991 posed a question before the Orthodox faithful, which was a challenge for other Orthodox societies before. What impact has civil identity for the self-understanding of a church? And do national borders impact ecclesial identity? The question has a special meaning for Orthodox compared to other churches and religions, which follow either the concept of a global church, like the Catholic Church, with one center, or the concept of regional church structures as most Protestant churches. But nevertheless, church unity across borders is actually also a problem for these churches, as, for example, the current synodal process of the Catholic Church shows. For the Orthodox churches, the problem of the linkage of nation and church shapes theological and canonical debates since more than a century, when ethnophilitism was condemned in 1872. This decision obviously did not resolve the problem. We still have the difficult situation of Orthodox diaspora, open debates in different parts of the world. And we have a war in Ukraine, which makes obvious that this question is not a trivial one, and it's not a question of canonists at their desks. It is a question that may be escalating aspect of war. When Russia's war against Ukraine started in 2014, the Orthodox landscape consisted of 3 major Orthodox churches and several minor communities. The churches had difficult relations with no mutual recognition. However, they cooperated on a strategic level in the Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. The general religious plurality offered, so to say, a safe space for Orthodox corporations, in spite of the Orthodox inability to engage in an inner Orthodox dialogue. As we know from every other war, war strengthens polarities, black and white, as well as friend and foe thinking. The churches in Ukraine trapped, quite willingly, I would say, into these dichotomies, and it seems to me that the Sovietization of the religious life in Ukraine, described by Nadia Belyakova some years ago, plays out very much at this point. Mutual accusations, especially the strong will to find and to boost the mistakes and the failures of the other, and the paradigm of social and other media that only bad news are good news, led to a demonization of the other. Grassroots initiatives of cooperation had a hard time to justify their work. And I'm still wondering if the representatives of the churches active in social media really understand their visibility and their according responsibility to shape the public discourse on the one or in the other day. The establishment of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine in 2018 and 19, in spite of the massive politicization along this process, opened a certain window of opportunity to find a new way of Orthodox coexistence in a majority Orthodox country. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine stepped out of the shadow of uncanonicity and claimed to open a new way of not only Orthodox Ukrainian identity, but also of a new behavior in relation to the other. I remember well the first header of the official homepage of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which called "A Church Open to All." Then I remember the 10 theses of the initiative group of priests and many other initiatives at this time. Most remarkably, the new political leadership in that time under Zelensky tried to keep out of the relationship between the Orthodox churches and thus gave them the opportunity to find a way of coexistence regulated exclusively by their own principles and priorities. However, the only thing what really happened was a virtual and real fight about parishes. You might remember regular counts like in a football match and the fastidious reports about the partly violent transfers of parishes. And what also happened was a new effort to gain political power via legal drafts, for example, about the renaming of the church, about military chaplains and the religious communities with administrative center in the aggressor state. In that time, so we talk still about 2018-19, in that time, the number of just Orthodox in the famous service of Razumkov Center grew to an all-time maximum. Initiatives to bring both churches in a dialogue with the opportunity to overcome mistrust existed, although on a very limited level. I remember a certain hope for something like a confessionalization among the Orthodox in Ukraine, which could have served as a model for the Orthodox world, where the question of jurisdictions and ethnic identity became the main challenge for modern ecclesiology. The strong civil society in Ukraine had a special impact on the development of some kind of balance, because for them the main question was how the churches could contribute to a society based on human rights, democracy, and dignity. However, For some parts of the churches, to dismiss the other was more important, and the legacy of hatred and distrust prevailed to a large part. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church ceased from almost all public discourses due to the pressure from both Russia and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. It was not able to find a clear position to the war due to strong pro-Russian currents among the bishops. The strong anti-ecumenical position of Metropolitan Onufri prevented a meaningful appearance in interreligious and interconfessional meetings. And on the other side, those representatives of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church who were present at these meetings were often met with distrust by the other side. When Russia a year ago started its full-scale war, the relation between the Orthodox churches was shaped by mistrust and accusations. The reports of the alleged systematic pressure on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church with detailed lists of parishes and events became a crucial tool for Russia to start and to legitimize its war. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church stopped this reporting in February 2022, but this was clearly too late. After a time of calm down in the religious field after February 24th, the pressure on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to finally split with Moscow grew in summer within and outside the church. The council in May 2022 opened a new path for dialogue between the two churches, and the believers of the church took a decisive role in these processes at the council, but also through open letters and calls to the church leadership. This empowerment of parishes, of the people of God in relation to the institution and the leadership, seems to be crucial for the future of dialogue and peaceful coexistence. On the one hand, the mobilization of the believers of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church shows that there is, in fact, a lively flock not interested in making easy switches from one church to the other. They have an interest in staying with their church, but they want their church to move and to be sensitive of their people. They want the church to be a safe space for their everyday needs, especially in times of war. On the other hand, we could see the leaderships and the public speakers of both churches fighting back this self-empowerment of the faithful. The initiatives of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and online dialogue platforms were met again with distrust, defamation, and sarcasm. The lack of trust and the impatience with the church learning the language of self-responsibility is all too understandable after years of disregard and in times of war. However, it is also a huge obstacle for dialogue. Finally, in fall 2022, the state policy in relation to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church changed radically and gave a new impulse to hate speech between the churches. The use of legal measures against collaboration is an important tool for the state security in times of war. However, the public discourse transferred this legal frame to the church as a whole, to believers serving Ukraine on every level in this war. A lot of mechanisms painfully recall Soviet times, among others the way to use state institutions to regulate church relations, and the way to dismiss critique as propaganda of the enemy. The discussions about the statute of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the decisions of the Council as markers for true independence from Moscow are somehow the latest chapter of the contested coexistence of different Orthodox churches. The term autocephaly became the cornerstone for providing independence, as if a word or a tomos could replace the change of mindset, and if a change of mindset would be impossible without the right word. At the same time, the new calendar is presented as demarcation line, and theological books in Russian language are presented as proof for being a Moscow church. The war is a time where everyday practices are weaponized. However, the current way of the churches to stigmatize everyday religious practices as a signpost of the enemy contradicts the claim to be an open church and a society proud of its religious diversity and heading for democracy and equality. From my point of view, and for the moment now, the aim to have a united autocephalous church in Ukraine includes an understanding of exclusion, of discrimination and homogenization, which is not compatible with the idea of an open orthodoxy. This is, of course, an effect of the war, and this is also an effect of the problematic situation of Orthodox ecclesiology in general. However, It would be the task of the churches and of their intellectual groups to counter this temptation. There are several open letters and concepts for future dialogue between the churches, from both churches, from the 10th thesis group to the letters in summer 2022, up to the last documents of the meeting on February 16th. Looking at the history of interchurch relations in Ukraine during the last decades, I'm still missing one point, which from the perspective of peace research is crucial for overcoming conflict. It is the dealing with the past concept, which includes the processing of own mistakes, of failures and guilt. The absolutization of the own position as the only right and true is not only an obstacle for dialogue, but also for the inner church community between divergent positions. At the IOTA conference of Orthodox theology some weeks ago in Greece, we had an exceptional panel on healing of wounded memories. And this panel made very clear how important it would be to develop a theology of collective responsibility and repentance, which is lacking, in fact, in all of our churches. No church is good in acknowledging own institutional mistakes. To delegate humbleness and repentance to liturgy and individual confession is not helpful where social legacies and structures maintain distrust and offense. So as a conclusion, I would like to point to the chances rather than to the problems. The last years opened some opportunities for Orthodox peaceful coexistence in Ukraine, which are sometimes hard to see in the situation of war and pressure. However, 3 points I take out from these years. First, there is a strong movement of laity in Ukraine, which is willingly to shape the future of the church and of society, even against a resistant leadership. Second, there's an impulse in both churches to detach from Soviet legacy, as well as from meticulous canon law, to open orthodoxy for a modern society. Third, there will be no future for a peaceful Orthodox coexistence without dealing with the traumas of the past. And both churches have a unique chance to start the theological effort in writing history together. There are huge obstacles to all 3 points, but there's also some hope. Thank you.
We would like to continue now with our next paper presented by Roman Soloviy from Eastern European Institute of Theology. And his topic today is Russian aggression against Ukraine, the response of national and international Protestant communities. Roman?
Yes, dear colleague, thank you for inviting to participate in this event. It's an honor and pleasure to be together with so many distinguished scholars from many countries and to discuss and to deal with topics that are so relevant and timely. I will just briefly outline main aspects of this problem that is the theme of my presentation, and basically I will talk about Ukrainian Protestant response, Russian Protestant response, and international Protestant communities' response to the aggression. Well, when we talk about Ukrainian Protestant communities, the first reaction to the war, the full-scale war that started a year ago, was a radical condemnation of the Russian intervention as an unjust and unprovoked act of aggression against Ukraine. On the second day of the war, there was a statement made by the Council of Evangelical Protestant Churches of Ukraine, which actually unites more than 7,000 of Protestant communities of Ukraine. And I would quote, "The Council of Evangelical Protestant Churches of Ukraine calls for utmost prayerful unity today, as Ukraine is defending itself from the invaders, as Ukrainian cities are burning down, and as hundreds of thousands of people are forced to leave their homes. We pray for the Lord to intervene and stop the president of the Russian Federation himself and those who believe that the war, the destruction of our cities, villages, infrastructure, the occupation of territories, and most importantly, the bloodshed and casualties among civilians, the lives of hundreds and thousands of soldiers lost in battle, can be a solution of problems of this world broken by sin." In the first days of the war, the leaders of Ukrainian evangelical seminaries formed a coordinating group. The main objective of this group, in addition to cooperation in tackling the challenges of evacuation and relocation, was to consolidate the efforts of Ukrainian theologians to record, reflect on, and broadcast the experience of war by Ukrainian evangelicals and their ministry to their suffering compatriots. One of the first projects of our group was the Voices project, serving still as a platform through which we organize events to inform the global evangelical community about the challenges the war poses to the people of Ukraine, and in particular to evangelical churches, and about our efforts to respond to these challenges. On March 17, 2022, we held the first event, the Russia-Ukraine War Evangelical Voices. At this event, we shared how a new, more brutal phase of the war smashed the world in which all Ukrainians used to live and left almost the entire population devastated and distressed. This act of aggression has impacted evangelical churches and theological educational institutions of Ukraine. Ukrainian evangelicals are engaged in volunteer work and help to the refugees, victims of the war, the Ukrainian army, and territorial defense units. This event was our attempt to voice out the pain of the Ukrainian people and cry to the world, Christianity, specifically to evangelical communities around the world, for help, advocacy, and support. On March 31, 2022, we held the second event, the Russia-Ukraine War Women's Voices. The war in Ukraine affects everyone without distinguishing between civilians and soldiers, between young and old, between men and women. And this discussion was about the experience of a woman mother, a woman wife, a woman volunteer, a woman theologian, just a woman who one day found herself at the center of this terrible war. On December 22, the third Voice event took place, titled Russia-Ukraine War Evangelical Voices, 300 Days of the War. And this event brought to light how over these 300 days of war, Russia has turned many Ukrainian cities into cemeteries unsuitable for normal life and deprived people of their homes, relatives, and certainly of the future. We invited all interested to join us and hear the testimonies of those who daily resist and the cruelty of the war, to build up dialogue space and share the human experience. The most important document of our coordinating group, later signed by the leaders of 24 Ukrainian evangelical seminaries, is the appeal of the representatives of Ukrainian evangelical theological institutions to the world evangelical community regarding the war, the Russian Federation against Ukraine, breaking through the sound of air raid sirens. This appeal was read on November 15, 2022 at the International Council for Evangelical Theological Education consultation in Izmir, Turkey. So basically, we were talking there that we call for a solidarity with the millions of Ukrainian refugees and those hundreds of thousands in grave danger under the Russian occupation or on the front lines of war, and it was like an invitation to pray to the King of Peace for the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, the establishment of just and lasting peace, and the guarantees for our country's protection from new acts of aggression in Russia. The second aspect of our response as Ukrainian evangelicals to the war was and still is assistance to the society and the country from the very first hours of the war. I have to highlight that, broadly speaking, before Maidan and Revolution of Dignity, many Ukrainian Protestants were still in a post-Soviet system of values. That is, they were denominationally isolated, focused more on the intra-church issues, distanced from social and political problems of the country as belonging to the earthly, sinful, and secular domain. However, the Revolution of Dignity and the following war in the east of Ukraine prompted Protestant congregations to discover a new image of the church as church without walls. As my colleague and friend Joshua Searle claims, this is a missional church that recognizes God's presence in the world, influences all domains of society in accordance with gospel values, supports civil society, brings hope to the people, and builds authentic communities of grace. For many Protestants, it became evident that Christians should be aware of their vocation and responsibility for the nation's destiny in times of national challenges. So in the first terrible hours and days of the war, the evangelical churches of Ukraine, in particular educational institutions of Ukraine, launched their Ministry of Mercy and Relief, which continues to this day, having facilities, transportation, and other resources. The churches and seminaries opened their buildings to the refugees, providing them with shelter, food, and medical, psychological, and legal assistance. Many seminary staff and students and pastors have joined to the ranks of volunteer initiatives, putting their lives in danger from enemy shelling. They were engaged in evacuation of the people from the combat zone, delivering the most basic necessities such as medicines, food, generators, and hygiene products, even to the regions already occupied by the Russian invaders, like it was in Kherson region. I just briefly give one example. It's the Evreysky Christian Institute. This institute being evacuated in the early days of the war to safer Ivano-Frankivsk, but institute volunteers provided enormous assistance to the city and region throughout the 10 months of Kherson's occupation. Accepting the risk of arrest and torture, the institute volunteers transported medicine and food to the occupied territories. In addition, using a network of contacts in the Kherson region, the institute purchased food from the local farmers, then distributed it to all those in need. Immediately after the liberation of Kherson, the institute's volunteers joined the efforts to rebuild life in the city despite the daily barrage of fierce shelling. I would like also briefly mention the Ministry of Seminaries and Churches in the west of Ukraine, which in the first hours of the war were transformed into humanitarian centers to help refugees and still do this work. Also, work on overcoming the traumas caused by the war has also become a crucial area. Protestant seminaries implement relevant training programs, conduct various courses for pastors, training them in counseling skills, and publish the necessary materials. Just recently, we published a book called Tackling Trauma, Podolania Traumy for the pastors. Also, another aspect of our action is assistance to the Ukrainian military forces. But it is one of the most complicated issues, the attitude of evangelical Christians toward military service, particularly not only as paramedics or chaplains, but as members of combat units. Traditionally, the evangelical churches of Ukraine took a pacifist position, didn't participate in military service, or refused to take the pledge of allegiance in Soviet times. Since Ukraine independence, young Christians have usually done alternative service instead of military service. Something began to change during the Revolution of Dignity and the beginning of Russian aggression in Donbass and Crimea in 2014. The brutal crackdown on peaceful demonstrants by the Yanukovych regime, followed by Russia's aggressive moves, provoked a strong reaction from the entire civil society of Ukraine, which opposed both the corrupt regime of the pro-Russian Yanukovych government and Russia's attempt to annex Ukrainian territories. Over the years, evangelical churches have discovered the true values of civil liberties and the importance of cooperation with volunteer groups and other social movements that carry out social, educational, and other projects. Gradually, the traditional escapist attitude of evangelical churches toward public life gave way to a more active social position, a growing sense of responsibility for the fate of the country, and more Christians became involved in political processes. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion in 2014, evangelical Christians in Ukraine have supported the Ukrainian armed forces, but their assistance has been limited to volunteer work and chaplaincy. The full-scale invasion of Russia in February 22, the incredible brutality of Russian troops, and the massive crimes against humanity committed by them caused a sharp shift in the attitude of evangelicals toward the armed forces and military service. If earlier the churches mostly disapproved of the participation of their believers in military service as combatants, and in some cases even imposed church penalties for this, with the outbreak of the Great War, the churches support any decision of their believers to provide volunteer aid, serve as chaplains, or fight in this war with weapons. Here we have an example of how the practice of Christian life in extreme conditions outpaces its theological justification. The spontaneous reactions of both individual believers and church associations to the challenges of the war still needs to be understood. Still, it is clear that along with the traditional experience of not resisting evil and radical pacifism, Ukrainian evangelical churches leave open the possibility for believers to engage in military action. One might even say that based on their bitter experience of war, our own version of a just war is being formed as a necessary measure aimed primarily at protecting innocent people from violence by the aggressors and protesting against the enemy unjust and unprovoked invasion. And the last aspect of Ukrainian reaction is break in relations with Russian Protestants. In 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbas region led to the severing of long-standing relationships between evangelical communities in Russia and Ukraine. Ukrainian Protestants supported pro-democracy sentiment of revolution of dignity, and at the same time, Russian Protestant unions have failed to condemn the country's aggression against Ukraine, often expressing criticism of the revolution of dignity. Full-scale Russian invasion has alienated two communities even more, perhaps irreparably. Terrible anguish was brought on by discovered mass atrocities following the Russian military's withdrawal from area northwest of the Ukrainian capital. Two neighboring suburbs, Bucha and Irpin, bore the most devastation. These neighborhoods had an untypically large Protestant population, being home to more than 24 of mission organizations, in addition to a dozen of Protestant churches. At this point, relations between the Protestant communities of both countries are almost completely suspended. There are some contacts within the international Protestant communities, but they are minimal. Instead, heated discussions with mutual accusations often erupt in social networks and the media. And just very briefly, I would like to talk about the reaction of Russian evangelical churches to the war. Initially, the dominant Russian Protestant response to the February invasion was fear and shock. Leaders of the unions of evangelical Christian Baptists across the former USSR, including those Ukraine and Russia, even appealed to Putin to negotiate peacefully. Briefly posted online in early March, a petition signed by some Protestant representatives, mostly in cities across Russia, further condemned their nation's actions as fratricide and called for repentance. So most of Russian evangelical unions or prefer to stay neutral in the context of the war or openly support the actions of Russian authorities and refuse to condemn the act of aggression against Ukraine. I just will mention one case here. It's a statement of Sergei Rakhovsky on behalf of Spiritual Council of Russian Union of Christians of Evangelical Faith in the beginning of the war, February 25th. In his appeal, he support for the actions of Russian authorities and refused to condemn the act of aggression. He says that it's a fratricidal conflict with those two nations have shared history and called to pray for peace. But later on in March, he continues his to develop his position, and speaking about the war in Ukraine, he said that this is war, that we have no other way to protect the truth today, and he is sure we are all driven by love, and we have no hatred. We are driven by love. It is love that destroys evil. So actually, he tries to justify the war as an act of love to Ukrainian Christians, to protect them from being spoiled by liberal Western values. And probably the same position is also expressed in many other representatives of this union. The leaders of other evangelical unions in Russia, like Eduard Grabovenko and others, they made an appeal, but we have an alarm. But in their appeals, they just talked about sorrow and pain. They asked for peaceful negotiations, but they were not able to condemn the war. And for Ukrainian evangelical Christians was especially painful when during Congress of the Russian Unions of Evangelical Christian Baptists in May 2022, then they signed a letter to President of Russia in which they said, "We wish you, dear Vladimir Vladimirovich, good health and wisdom for the sake of many achievements for the benefit of Russia and the whole world." And you can imagine how painful it was to read those letters for Ukrainian evangelicals. And just briefly, a few words about international Protestant community's reaction. Basically, I will concentrate on the response of World Evangelical Alliance as the largest evangelical global community. So World Evangelical Alliance made an appeal and organized a lot of practical tools and platforms to help Ukraine. And its primary focuses are advocating for the end of Russia aggression and for the restoration of peace in Ukraine and across Europe, raising funds to support the churches and ministries that are directly affected, bringing together members and partners to coordinate assistance to Ukrainian believers, spotlighting those who are agents of transformation, and sharing key prayer focuses with the global church. So basically, global evangelical Protestant community assisted Ukrainian evangelical churches that are helping refugees by evacuating them across borders or to safer areas within Ukraine, providing accommodation, food, medicine, and other help, and responding to the emerging need caused by the war. And most of evangelical churches around the world and Protestant churches made their appeals in which they condemned the war and also organized all kinds of support platforms for Ukraine. Well, one of the most big initiative is the initiative of the Church of England in United Kingdom, which became one of the main partners of the state in the program for Ukrainian refugees, which is called Home for Ukrainians. And because of the support of Church of England, more than 100,000 of Ukrainian refugees have found places to stay in England. And I know that the same initiatives were supported by many other evangelical churches all around the world. So just to make a conclusion, Ukrainian churches responded to the war with condemnation of the war, with all kinds of relief ministries and initiatives on very large scale, and also in breaking all kinds of relationships with Russian Protestants. Russian evangelical communities or prefer to stay neutral, kind of we are not part of this world, we live in spiritual sphere, we have nothing to do with this conflict, or, and it's very tragic case of a Russian Pentecostal Union led by Sergei Ryakhovsky, they explicitly support the war, and it was very painful for Ukrainian Protestants to see, for instance, ministers and pastors of that union who would come to occupy territories and try to do all kinds of ministry, social ministry, to plant churches, actually kind of accepting the new, what is called political geography imposed to Ukraine by Russia. And international Christian community condemned the war, evangelical community condemned the war, and provided a huge assistance to Ukraine, and especially to Ukrainian churches that are trying to bring help to all the victims of the war in Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.
We are moving on to our least but not last, the presentation. And Mykhaylo Yakubovych will make a presentation about the Islamic perspective, rediscovering jihad and the Muslim communities in Ukraine and in Russia. Mykhaylo, welcome, and floor is yours.
Nice to meet all of you, and I will have a brief presentation. I already tried my screen share. I hope it will not be really boring. Can you see it now?
Yes, yes.
Just to check. Yes, so I'm starting from the very beginning. So my presentation is going to address few important issues already discussed by some of other participants for the Christian church mostly. And in my presentation, I'm going to answer why especially Russian Muslims, in my case, mostly supporting that war, and why Ukrainian Muslims not. So in my perspective, it depends also on the structure of leadership and many other reasons. Okay, I'm going to discuss now. So the topic is about contemporary narratives of Islamic just war theory in the Muslim community of Ukraine and Russia. So I will just start briefly introducing what is just an unjust war theory in a book written by one of the big American scholars, Michael Walzer, actually, and the book published in the 70s. He introduced a kind of a theory, not a new one, but there was like a growing interest after this book published it into how can war be justified. And for him, it should be a cause, a probability of success, a competent authority, right intention, proportionality, justice, last resort, and so on. So recently, by the way, he published also a paper saying that those soldiers from the Russian army who were mobilized, they are in the same status as Nazi soldiers in Germany. So they could be blamed for their own crimes, but not the crimes of the country, like they have no choice. And there was a discussion in the Institute of Advanced Study, Princeton, where on the website he published it. But my topic is about another, like have to compare this theory with some intra-Islamic vision of the war, and especially the so problematic notion of jihad discussed for many years in both Western and Eastern scholarship. So we have what just 4 answers of what is jihad in Muslim tradition. I'm not going to discuss it with like a whole theory. There are a lot of books and articles, many other studies written. So it could be offensive, defensive war against so-called infidels. Who are those infidels and why someone should wage a war against them? That's another question, but still it exists in Muslim law. It's a spiritual struggle for the sake of Allah, like some self-improvement and so on. It could be observed in Islamic tradition like Sufism. Some people say it's mystical tradition, let it be for the to be brief here. Islamic social and human rights activism, so like defending rights of the Muslim minorities somewhere in non-Muslim or secular state. It's also a kind of jihad because it's makes a Muslim feel themselves more comfortable. Also, for the 20th and 21st century Islamism, this is about establishment of the Islamic rule. This full the country should be Islamic, despite we have many conceptions in the Muslim community what is Islamic rule and what is Islamic state as it is. Also, we have still in all the three conceptions, all 4 conceptions, of jihad, we have at least few main actors. This is inherent actors, Islamic leadership, government. So there should be some leader who is responsible for doing that. Or like in Islamic scholarship, we have an Amir. We have a Muslim community, be it Ummah, like a global Muslim community, or this is about maybe some small communities like they have in Muslim law, like Aqaliyat al-Muslima, meaning Muslim minority somewhere. And it should be enemy, of course. The someone, it could be infidels, heretics, it could be those who violates the Muslim rules, it can be secular state. There are many actors in that, but at least we have these 3 actors when Muslims are talking about a jihad. So starting to coming back to this structure, I will start from the Russian Islamic leadership. What do we have in Russia for the Muslim leadership? You know that Russia is one of the biggest Muslim countries. I mean, they have around from 15 to 20 millions of Muslims living there, with a lot of different communities, mostly represented by so-called muftis. So mufti, I mean, the leader of Islamic community in Russia, this tradition exists from 18th century, from the times of the Russian Empire, then Soviet Union. He's formally elected. But usually when we have main authorities of Islam in Russia, like Talgat Tajuddin, Ravil Gainuddin, other people, they are serving as muftis for many years, for 10, 20 years, and so on. For example, Talgat Tajuddin, head of a central religious board of Muslims of Russia, quite authoritative organization. He started his activities still in Soviet Union, and he continues to do that now. But we have also a generation of newest leaders like Kamil Samigulin, the Mufti of Tatarstan. So they have also a board of scholars, Mufti representatives of local imams. But of course, all those muftis, formally they are independent, but in reality, they all should be loyal to government. They were checked their personality was well reviewed by the Russian state. Sometimes they receive also funding from the government via different programs. They have bodyguards from the government even sometimes, and they report to the government the Muslim activities, what is called in Russia as prophylactic extremism. It's about like trying to prevent the extremism among the Muslims. So like if someone in the community preaching something which is dangerous to the state or considered to be dangerous, they report that. They sometimes writing weekly or even monthly reports. I mean, both local imams and area representatives. So we have here like a lot of people actually, starting from President of Russia, and with him also Talgat Tajuddin, Ravil Gainuddin, also the Mufti of Crimea, who took in 2014 a side of Russia, definitely, and now supporting a war. So this picture represents actually a position of Russian Moody. Yes, they are all united in like working in favor of the government now. Also, we have a so-called traditional Islam narrative in Russian Islam. So usually they prize in media, they prize in academic books that Russia should return to the traditional Muslim values. What does it mean? It's adherence to a kind of domestic tradition, meaning mostly Sunni, Hanafi, sometimes Sufi, sometimes Shafi'i, but mostly it's about a Sunni Maturidismal Asharism in the modern understanding of the term. I mean, theological school, of course, loyalty to the local and the federal governments, local role, and the critique of any foreign Muslim influence, blaming them as sectarianism, like all fighting with Wahhabis, Salafis, Hizb ut-Tahrir communities, and many of those organizations like Tablighi Jamaat and Hizb ut-Tahrir, they are banned in Russia, of course, as extremist organization, but there's a long list of the index of prohibited literature, many organizations and so on, blamed it as Muslim extremists, actually, or some people who are supposed to be or condemned by government as to be the extremists, they are or not in reality. That's another question, of course. But it's allows to the Russia to persecute every kind of Muslim opposition in the country. So finally, we see, for example, there is a recently promoted kind of a poster in Czechia with the Muslims for the victory of Russia with the letter Z, symbol of the Russian aggressive war against Ukraine. So they are promoting it in the front of the mosque. So yeah, it's usually a normal practice in many Muslim areas in Russia. Also, switching back to the narratives, so we have a kind of specially developed Russian military Muslim identity, like Muslims fighting for Russia. So what is it about? This is, first of all, mass propagation of Muslim participation in Soviet-German war. They call it Great Patriotic War on the side of Soviet Union against some fascism. They are not different. They have no difference on fascism or Nazism and so on. They usually treat them as the same level. There's also some ideological reasons for that, but still they have it, and there are a lot of books published on that, a lot of historical memory promoted, sometimes also fake memory and so on, that there are so many Muslims who were fought for the Soviet Union and they were loyal to the government, so they are good people, we should follow their example. Also, there is a constant fear of religious extremism. Of course, the case of Ichkeria, I mean the Chechen wars, 2 wars, where government says that the control over the North Caucasus, persecuting all the opposition, be it a national opposition or religious opposition, the narrative fitting with the narrative of so-called traditional Islam. Later, this is about building religious identity within the national, Tatar, Bashkir, and so on, but they usually claim that for the minor nation, they are part of one big nation. So they're like a small national identity inside the very big one, the Russian one. So like you can speak on your language, you can preserve some of your culture, but inside this friendship of people so-called in a big country with a narrative which is coming probably from the Soviet times or even Russian imperial times, with try to imaginate Russians as a big brother to everyone who is watching, who is caring about all those minor nations, because without them they cannot not exist at all with the nation states and so on. So if you're asking some of the representatives from Tatarstan or Northern Caucasus, so they usually answer, we cannot be an independent state, we should be integrated into Russia very deeply and so on. There's also about strong political Westernophobia, struggle toward Western values, the same like in the Russian Orthodox Church, but there is a big paradox. For example, in the many European countries, Russia supports right-wing parties like Alternative für Deutschland and many others in Germany, or some organizations in France. They usually vote in favor to the Russian politics, but they have strong anti-Islamic agenda. Same way inside Russia and in the Middle East, they usually use a narrative of bad West. So in the Europe, they spread a kind of Islamophobia. In the Middle East, they spread a kind of Westernophobia. And of course, among the Muslims of Russia, who say they are for so-called traditional values together with the Russian Orthodox Church. And this is about democracy. This is about the human rights. This is about every other things which are associated mostly with the West. So that's one of the gatherings in Moscow. You see like the people in traditional Tatar clothes and with this called Georgievskaya Lenta in Russia, or the symbols of the Soviet, Imperial, Russian, so the mix of everything we see here. But there are a lot of pictures coming from Russia every year with the like Muslims standing for the Soviet victory and Russian victory. So also, but exactly coming back to the jihad narrative, who claimed that the war against Ukraine is a kind of jihad and why? First of all, this is about the Mufti of Chechen Republic, Saleh Mijiev. He said that, yeah, this is jihad, but this is the jihad because we have a problem in Ukraine that's Western imposed values of LGBT people. So like homosexuals and so on, they are a threat to the Chechen Republic, to the Muslims of the North Caucasus. So we should fight against them. So this is a kind of justification for the jihad. Later I will come back to that. Then we have also a Mufti of Central Spiritual Muslim Board, Talgat Tajuddin, who say that the reason is the religious obligation to protect homeland. So we have a homeland, which is of course not a kind of Tatarstan, but or Bashkiria, but it is about Russia. As he once said, that we live in a caliphate, Holy Ruthenian state, Khalifat Svetaya Rus. He once said that, and there are a lot of controversial stuff coming every year from Talgat Tajuddin, but he is in office and he is invited. Even recently, when a few days ago Putin delivered his speech, he was sitting in the first rows of the big gathering in Moscow. So there's religious obligation to protect homeland. Then we have some, of course, Russian religious leaders who mentioned necessity to fight, and they reacted to the mobilization into the Russian army. There's a Mufti of Tatarstan, Kamil Samigulin. He said there is an oath of allegiance from Muslims to Russia, necessity to follow. Like they, Muslims, have a kind of a treaty with Russians, and if Russia commands to go to the war, it's okay, let's go to the war. And also he mentions one of the Quranic verses, relevant it or not, it's a big question, but also he referred to the so-called hadith, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad that Hubal Watan min al-Iman, meaning love to the motherland is a part of belief. But in reality, if checking in the Arabic sources, this is it's not a saying recorded in the canonical books of Sunnah, of the Prophet Muhammad's tradition. It's a later invention somewhere in the Shia sources, despite he is a Sunni. So it's not a real hadith, it's not a real tradition, it's something just mentioned that in that context, but nobody cares, of course, because it's religious authority who says that. Later, we also have Mufti of Spiritual Administration of Muslim in Russia, Ravil Gainuddin. He said that the hegemony of the West must be destroyed. So there is a special way of Russia, a third way of the world, and it's in some ways Muslim way. So, but the West is a threat to Russia, so it should be destroyed by the war in Ukraine, of course. Moreover, we have some Russian Islamic leaders killed in action in Ukraine. We have Imam Muhtasib, a middle level of Imam from Omsk Oblast, who was killed in Luhansk area. He was a volunteer. He's So he joined voluntarily the Russian forces. And we have Imam Khatib of Mulovskaya Moscow, some imam from some village who was killed in Makivka in Donetsk. But of course, since Russia is having their losses, so probably this list is not complete. There are also some other people who are fighting, who are killed, but still we have no information of them. So some of the Russian religious leaders from the middle and lower level, they joined Russian army, not only saying, but they were on the front line and they were killed. So coming back, what about the Ukrainian side? So in Ukraine, we have also different institutions. One of most similar, with a similar structure, with the same mufti, with the same leadership. This is spiritual administration of Crimean Muslims, but they joined generally the Russian network of religious authority and they support war now. Then there is another like alternative in Kiev, spiritual administration of Crimean Muslims. And I will tell more about their position. Later, we have a spiritual administration of Ukrainian Muslims in Kiev with the head Sheikh Ahmed Tamim, but they condemned Russian aggression, but then they continuing their activities in Kiev and other areas like nothing happens. So like they are praying, they trying to be on a kind of neutral position because in the past they had many ties to Russia and not only Russia. And there is spiritual administration of Ukrainian Muslims. Ummah also now not so active. So first of all, I would like to mention that position, that this is position of the Kiev-based Mufti of Crimea, Aider Rustamov. He had 2 meetings with Muslim prisoners of war from Russia. He tried to deliver them Ukrainian position, and since the Russian aggression is not a kind of jihad, so but Ukrainian defensive is justified. So Ukrainian Muslims, they can go to war, but he's not calling it a kind of jihad. This is just a religious imposed obligation to defend life, property, and honor. So there is a right to defend that in actually quite openly proclaimed in the Muslim religious belief. So he says it's legal, but it's not jihad, even being on Ukrainian case. Also, we have a very interesting personality, Said Ismailov, who is the ex-mufti of spiritual administration of Ukrainian Muslims. He says this is jihad. So the Ukrainian Muslims who joined Ukrainian army or any other voluntary battalion fighting against Russians, they are participants of jihad. But he's an ex-mufti and he speaks only on his own now. Just coming back to the conclusion of my speech, so we have a main difference of jihad narratives. What do we have for the Russian Muslims? They mostly speak about the jihad or just war with no basic theological argument. So browsing all these fatwas, so-called religious statements on any kind of issues, I don't see any really good arguments presented here. So they mostly try to repeat what is said in Russian media, and we have to try to also to imagine this war as a defensive with a kind of militarism in Nazi communist imperial style. So in some way it reminds me of stories from the Muslims who were fighting in the First World War for the Russian Empire. Then in Soviet times, Stalin created religious leadership with a big support to the Soviet authority, or from the other side, Nazi created muftiates in the East Europe to play with them as a kind of a liberation strategy, be it against Soviet Union or somewhere in the Middle East against British imperialism, as I said. So this is something, it looks for me, it appears like something from the past. This is a typical totalitarian militarism with just a very few argued theological arguments presented, but it works generally because Russian Muslims are invited into foreign countries, into different conferences, and they try to justify this position like we are being attacked, we are on. But generally they just repeat what the government says without any deal with theological stances. So even this try to image this war as a jihad with checking some of the facts and browsing the argumentation. It's actually quite a fake theological implications inside all those statements. For the Ukrainian Muslims, this is a kind of mostly defensive war, definitely not jihad. Yes, some of them may imagine that, but it's not a general position, but the right to defend life, property and honor, but it generally fits to the Muslim religion activism, especially in a modern period when we have this solution of the concept of the big Ummah or of the Muslim state, when we have a growing Muslim communities in the West, so they describe themselves in a little bit other ways than those people living in the Middle East. So sometimes for them, like all kind of social activism, it's the only solution for the preservation of the identity. So we have also here a kind of fight of totalitarian state, or authoritarian state from the Russian side, a democratic state with the Muslims representing one position or the second position. So this is one of the attempts to answer why do those people support war and why do those people resist. So my final statement is that which option is close to the Islamic just war theory, meaning jihad actually is a kind of a just war, is a totalitarian militarism for the success of non-Muslim leadership, because obviously Russian leadership is not Muslim in any way, so it cannot be compared with any of medieval sources talking about jihad with the commandment of some leader, or it is about order to keep Muslim minorities safe and prosperous. For the Ukrainian case, I think the Muslim communities should answer to that question, not me on the academic side, but still we see that comparing all of those arguments and positions presented, so the answer is pretty obvious, at least for me. Thanks for your attention, and I will be happy to answer all of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mykhaylo. This was really very interesting, and I believe the audience will have many questions, and I already see that there are some questions to you, but now I would like to open the floor for discussion, and Iryna has invited all of you to write in the questions in the chat, and also she has invited the speakers to read the questions. So my question is, for those speakers who were not presenting now, what did you find the questions that you will take and answer, or would you want us to read them, or how we proceed? It also depends on you. I see there are questions from Ludmila Filipovich. I also see a question from Richard Croft. So my question is to Catherine and Regina. Did you find any questions in the chat that you would want to answer?
Perhaps I could pick up on a question that Ludmila raised, and it's echoed by also Eileen Barker as well. And I think this is a question that nags at all of us. We are aware of religious leadership across confessional groups that have proclaimed their support for this war. One is always wondering these days, with an internet and with so much evidence, these days when everyone has a cell phone, there is just a mountain of evidence of the atrocities that this war is creating, not just for Ukraine, but especially for Ukraine, but even for Russian soldiers who are serving, never mind even more broadly elsewhere in the world. One wonders, could it really be that people support this war? Could it be that this well-oiled machine of propaganda has in fact destroyed the conscience of a nation of people? And many of these questions reflect what forms of expression might or might not exist in Russia. For example, one wonders if the passivity of people is in fact maybe not an open form of opposition, but certainly not supportiveness. Up until, in fact, discussions over the one-year anniversary, I dismissed that as not a viable response, based on the fact that Elie Wiesel, for example, after World War II and the Holocaust, mentioned that silence always benefits the oppressor. Silence is always a form of complicity. And surely I would like to think that in the year 2023, if a person espoused racist, anti-Semitic, or other discriminatory comments or behaviors, that one wouldn't be silent and accept that and be passive. But it occurred to me recently that, you know, for many people in the West, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 came as a surprise. No one expected it to collapse so quickly and so bloodlessly. And so I do wonder sometimes, that made me think that perhaps we are facing somewhat of a parallel situation with Russia these days. There is very, very little visible or audible opposition. Of course, there's a state apparatus that ensures that there's very little visible or audible opposition. But I wonder if this kind of a passive non-supportiveness, if on some level something couldn't be activated there. I mean, in other words, having misread, and here I would say the Western countries in general, having misunderstood the support for the Soviet Union, I wonder if we are similarly perhaps misunderstanding, misreading Russian support for this war. But clearly, it's a difficult question because I do think a person of conscience could and should respond in some way, and a passive acceptance is not the appropriate response to the kinds of atrocities we're seeing.
Thank you. Maybe Regina, you would like
yes.
to?
Yes, I would like to. Yeah, first I also want to underline what Casey just said, because and I think it's not only misinterpreting or missing something. It's also that, of course, our perspective is very much focused now on what Patriarch Kirill, for example, is saying and how this radicalization and ideologization is taking place. And we miss already now to see how people, what means passive, it would be the question. Because I think I have several colleagues and people in Russia, and I know that they are by far not passive, but we don't see them. and we have no possibility to see them now because of the political circumstances they live in. But I agree that we have to be very cautious in thinking that there's nothing going on and everyone is compliant to the system. So then I would like to take up the question about if churches could be somehow, or religions could be somehow take part in ending the war. So the question of Tevo Laitila, and what kind of modernism does the Orthodox Church of Ukraine representative? So to the first question, do you think the churches have a role in ending war and reconstructing peace? I think yes and no. There are different dimensions in this question, and I would focus on the Ukrainian churches, in fact, because the Russian Orthodox Church for sure can't, I would say, at the moment be some constructive force to do something. Apart from, of course, repenting and the guilt which they had brought on themselves. But to look at the Ukrainian churches, I think there are two layers. The first one I would say is that the churches could counter the Russian weaponization of religion. So it would mean that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church would have a duty to distance more clearly from the collaborators, so to take out this instrument from the hands of the Russian Orthodox Church that this is our church and they are on our side. So they could be more visible, taking back their possibility to define who they are and where they stand, and not to be instrumentalized that most. But the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and also politics would have a duty to fight the hate speech and the demonization in society, which is used by the Russian side very clearly. They wait only for every occasion where someone is doing publicly, doing pressure on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and so on. So they could, in fact, limit this outreach of hate speech. And it would be very important to foster reconciliation within Ukraine. And for all religions, it seems to me, in Ukraine and for the whole society, it would be very important to somehow counter the ideology of the war in terms of the cultural wars, because Russia is operating with this liberal and conservative dichotomies in our world. And I don't see that the Russian churches are very conscious in fighting this understanding of that we have to fight liberal values. We have this problem in Ukraine too. So this would be, of course, demand a longer process of theological discussion about this. But at the moment, I see a very ambivalent stance. And this is also used by Russia and used for the war. And it will be used for destabilizing Ukrainian society in the future, I think. What I would say about modernism and the question about modernism in the Ukrainian Orthodoxy, of course, modernization in my perception is a buzzword for Orthodox. So modernization is evil, in fact. But I see a chance in Ukrainian Orthodoxy in general and in other Orthodox churches too, that what it means is to somehow be more open for what is going on in civil society, in sciences, and to detach from the state. So to make place in this Orthodox tradition of state-church relation for society, for civil society, for humanities, for the sciences, and to get in contact with this and to discuss this. And equally to the Catholic and to the Protestant churches, this process changes the church automatically. If you get in touch and if you start to have a dialogue with what is going on around you, you will change, call it modernization or not. But I think this is the way, it seems to me, the Orthodox churches go to. And if I may, I would like to have the last word to the last comment of Ludmila Filipovich about the differences, the fundamental differences between Ukrainians and Russians. And I would dare to disagree quite fundamentally here, because if you start to talk about ontological differences between people, you are on the same trap as Russians try to divide this world. You can't make out ontological differences due to ethnic or national belonging. This is a wrong way to go for, because you have different people, different Russian people, you have different Ukrainian people, and where will you do the cut of ontological difference? So I'm really would be very cautious in trying to outline some ontological difference between people. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. And we have a couple of other questions, and I would like just to pay attention for the question from the Richard Croft about the solidarity and the unity between different religions and denominations in the face of this war. Maybe I would like to invite Roman Soloviy to answer this question. And if you find also some thought that you would like to pronounce, please feel free.
Well, thank you. I might say that during this year of the war, we have in Ukraine a new level of, well, let's at least say interdenominational or interchurch cooperation. Like when we would talk about all kinds of volunteers initiatives, basically denominational lines do not matter there. And I have, in my personal experience, because I am involved all this year in many different volunteer projects, especially the work with displaced persons, we see that this goal to save the country, to save the nation, because it is still not clear that we as a nation, as a country, will survive in the final end of this war. It's still not clear. So this task to help all the victims of the war, to meet the challenges, help us to kind of put aside all denominational aspects and work together. So I might say, well, when we talk about the Council of Churches and Religious Organization in Ukraine, or when we talk about Council of Ukrainian Evangelical Protestant Churches, they work together. I do not think that we have many kind of misunderstandings or conflicts besides this all Orthodox issue that was mentioned today. So I might say that actually that started to take place after and during the Revolution of Dignity, when many Ukrainian churches for the first time met on a public arena representatives of other Christian traditions, and they discovered that those representatives of other Christian traditions, they are good Christians and they have the same purposes and goals for the country. And now we still continue to see this process of kind of working together and discovering the treasures of each one's tradition. And just one brief comment, I might say that I share a bit what Lyudmila Filipovich said. Well, especially when we mean by ontology, not a metaphysical ontology, but what is called rather social ontology. And social ontology of Russian society and Russian state and social ontology of Ukrainian society and Ukrainian state are very, very different. They differ historically. When we would go to the, well, let's say Middle Ages, we would see different kinds of how society is structured. We would see different social aspirations during the whole history. So it is not accidentally that basically we do not have Russian Christians who would be able explicitly condemn the war. The only initiative, Christmas declaration, is anonymous. Nobody is even able to disclose face, to give the name to this initiative. And when we try to engage in dialogue with representatives of this Christmas declaration, like for peace and against war, and we ask, do you really condemn the reasons of this war, the Russian world ideology, the neglecting of Ukrainians to be as a nation, to have our identity, they are not able to do so. So the social ontology is different. The tradition of political, of social life is quite different. And that's why we have Russian Muslims, Russian Pentecostals, and Russian Orthodox, and Russian Catholics supporting the war. And we have Ukrainian Muslims, evangelicals, Protestants, and Orthodox condemning this war. So I agree with Lyudmila Filipovich, the truth of religion in this situation is not the main aspect. The main aspect is the history and the social ontology in which those communities grew up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roman. I see 2 hands raised. I just want to ask you to be very brief because we also have other questions for other speakers, so we don't want to take their time. Regina, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, I would like to argue with this because I understand the difference, what you mean in social ontological and ontology and ontology or on a human basis. But this again is you determine a whole society and millions of people to be as they are now because of historical. I agree with historical and traditions of legacies, which of course have an impact on what we have now. But to make it an ontological question means that that you don't see any chance, or you don't give the people in there any chance to change. And this makes it impossible to get some future perspectives. How does everything will go on? So if you make it on an ontological level, then you are far away from developing future perspectives on anything in this society, in fact, about what you're speaking. And this means also it's connected to the question who is standing up and non-anonymously or showing their face of in disagreeing with what Russia is doing. You totally neglect the people who have to fly from so refugees from Russia who are speaking up and to have a voice and who are talking about them.
There are no refugees from Russia.
But are they not refugees?
No.
Are they not? So this would be one question, but the other question would be: are there no Russians anymore? They speak up. So we had the conference in Volos where Russian theologians stand up and said, we do not agree. You have the movement of the Christian vision from mostly Belarusian Christians, but also Russian Christians. You have Russian Orthodox Christians in Germany, in the United States, standing up and saying, this is not our war and we are against this war and we are fighting on everywhere we can. What are you doing with them? Are they not Russians anymore? So where do you put them?
You are talking about very, very small minority that will never be able of an agent of change in Russia. And Russia was always a totalitarian state run by political elites. Never any political activists or social activists or religious activists were agents of change in Russia since 15th, 16th century. And now it would be very naive to expect something good from those pacifist and other initiatives. If you would study Russian history kind of a bit better, you would agree with me. Okay, I'm not going to take
Thank you, Roman, but we need to continue. And Regina, thank you very much for this contribution to discussion. Ludmila, very short, very short,
because I would like to clarify. Maybe I have no time to explain better, but in relation to ontological differences, I mean what? Not a region, not nations, not another metaphysical, as Roman say. This is the characteristic of mentality, of the world view position, and they are different. And I think that we put the diagnosis for Russians. They get treated.
Thank you, Ludmila. I see Eileen has also raised her hand. Please, Eileen.
Yes, I'm just wondering whether, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just wondering whether we could think of what Ludmila has done as sort of ideal, typical in the sense of Weber, of two opposing dominant worldviews. And that might make it less intractable. Because obviously we have people who have a Ukrainian father and a Russian mother, and there is mixture both culturally and biologically. And ontological, I think, is a slightly dangerous word because it carries a whole lot of weight of inevitability, in a sense, as it being utter essence. Whereas if we talk about dominant worldviews, might that be acceptable to Ludmila?
She seems to be agreeing.
Yes, you're right. Yes, I agree with you.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Eileen. I see Catherine also has raised her hand.
I was just going to echo some of the points that had just been articulated. I mean, of course, there are historical differences. There are differences in historical experiences between Ukrainians and Russians, between Ukrainians and Poles and Americans and Canadians, on and on and on. There's always been a diversity of experiences, and this has bequeathed different legacies to different people. But I do want to come back to the point about Regina's point about change, that human society is constantly in flux, in change. And I think when one speaks in ontological terms, and I would also really guard against that kind of language, which suggests a sort of fixity, an unchanging, sort of an utter essence that is so fundamentally different. That's a radical othering of a neighboring country. And I mentioned that because there's other questions in that concern the issue of not just the role of religious organizations in determining a just war, but I think they will also play a role in determining a just peace. And I think it's important to keep in mind the idea that in establishing what will constitute a just peace, we are going to have to address historical legacies that have resulted in trauma and in suffering that very often was disproportionately experienced by one group over other groups. And I think that all, even prior to this war, still needed to be addressed, certainly in Ukraine and certainly in Russia. And I think this war has only compounded that issue. So I think it's really important to disentangle historical experiences, regardless of which period, the medieval period or imperial or communist or what have you, historical experiences and the different kinds of cultural practices that has given birth to, that we live with today, from the essence of a particular person or a particular group of people or a particular society, because people, groups, and societies are constantly adapting. They are constantly changing. They constantly adapt and change within the parameters that are available. And many of those parameters are bequeathed by history. So it's a delicate balancing act there. So that I would also put forward that kind of an idea. Also, I would caution against the kind of bifurcated position that Eileen mentioned about, Russians having this worldview, Ukrainians having that. I think that kind of sharp polarization makes the achievement of a just peace, an acceptable peace that will deliver something that really approximates a peaceful existence within Ukraine and a peaceful coexistence for Ukraine with the neighboring countries. So we need to break out of these good, evil, liberal, traditional kinds of totally bifurcated categories that make for friends and enemies.
Thank you, Catherine. I see that Eileen has raised her hand. Very short, quick response, Eileen, if you have some.
Yeah, a quick one. I said dominant worldview. And I think I found what Ludmila was saying would be helpful if we think of it as a dominant worldview, because this means that it is changeable. One can see changes over time, and you can allow for different worldviews also to be present. But this brings in the question of power,
yes,
and the power for imposing a dominant worldview. And this leads to a whole lot of structural and cultural differences. And if we understand it that way, then it doesn't put an ending in the sense that perhaps different people's understanding of ontology does.
Thank you, Eileen. And thank you all for this very interesting discussion. I would like now to return to the questions that we have in the chat, particularly to Mykhaylo. There are at least two questions. First, can you comment on response of Muslim authorities and Muslim populations in Russia to treatment of Tatars in Crimea? And then there was another question, do Russian imams still receive a unified text of Fridays Kutab from the central level. Mykhaylo, can we?
Yeah, thank you so much. But
yeah.
probably just sorry for very brief note, continuing the discussion just happened. Just I would like to remind that we are talking about the war, and war is a killing. You are killing and you are being killed. That's a reality. And if just very small, so it's ontological question, of course, because it's your existence or it's the existence of enemy. Just in the December of 2021, I was in the online. I was a participant of one conference in St. Petersburg with Russian scholars in December of 2021. Just in 2 months, many of them signed a petition to President Putin supporting war against Ukraine. They want to kill me as Ukrainian. So what's happened? You are sitting in the room, even online, but after 2 months, someone comes and say, you should be killed. You are not human because you should be Russian and you should be dead. That's true. So it's ontological question. As I said, a very big German thinker, Martin Heidegger, that the freedom is the ability for everything to exist. So they are not giving for us the opportunity to exist. That is the question. So it's their self-determination, like being totally different because it's a war, it's a killing. One thing is existing or another, one people or another. This is how do they making the theory. So if talking about ontological differences, so this is Russia, of course, and I agree with that, who imposes that way, that they are different people from everyone. And if they repeat it constantly for many years, so of course we try, some people start to comment in the same way. But just coming back to my question, so I think that
very briefly, please, Mykhaylo.
Very briefly. So what the response was most of Muslim organizations in Russia were in favor of the occupation of Crimea, and they continue to do that. They say that Crimean Tatars are well treated. There is a cathedral mosque in the progress of operation to build in city of Akhmesjit, they call it Simferopol, and so on. Also, so they support it. There are some oppositional leaders, but maybe they are silent on the topic. And if there are some people are arrested and persecuted, okay, that's normal stuff for them because they used to blame some people as extremists. So Russian Muslims, for many reasons, were in favor of the occupation of Crimea and supporting Crimean Tatars, just like one welcome to our big Russian family, as they said, especially people from Tatarstan, from Kazan, who continue to say that they are the same with Crimean Tatars, treating them as minor brothers. But another question about the United Text of Friday Hutba from the central level, yes, especially not every week, but some organization represented by Talgat Tajuddin, also in North Caucasus, they have this practice, and especially when something coming to a day of national unity or the announcement of mobilization or a day of victory, they have some text approved by the local government or central government. They sending it to mosques to proclaim. They have these imams are speaking on behalf of the organization. Of course, in some mosques, especially in Tatarstan area and so on, the people are more or less independent. But for some organizations, some of the crucial topics, they receive guidelines what to pronounce and what to say from the central, and this is also quite a different, not ontological, but quite a different practice from the Ukrainian Muslims or Muslims somewhere in Europe as well.
Thank you, Mykhaylo. Iryna?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have no time anymore, and maybe some questions we leave for further discussions. It seems that we need to have the opportunity to meet regularly and to discuss. So I'm very grateful for every speakers who was today with us and share their thoughts and the papers. Also grateful for our audience for very interesting questions, and we will see soon in another panel. As I understand, we need some break, maybe shortly than it was been planned, not 15 minutes, and maybe Ruslan say us when we will meet again. One more, very thankful for everyone that you are here. Thank you.
Thank you, Iryna, and thank you all. I'm joining Iryna I'm grateful for these discussions and thank you for organizers. And we are leaving few minutes before the next panel discussion. So hope to see you and stay strong in this difficult situation. Thank you.